Dr. Lim Kim Hua, CEO of Penang Institute, Tim Nicholas Schrupp, COO of Penang Institute, our distinguished panelists, YB Charles Santiago, Member of Parliament for Klang, Dato J. Jayasiri, Deputy Secretary General MITI, Dato Wong Siu Hai, Chairman of Malaysian American Electronics Industry, and Mr. Fawaz Abdul Aziz from Third World Network. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, a very good evening to each and every one of you. My name is Jen and I will be your MC for this evening. Penang Institute is proud to organize this forum entitled TPPA Impact on Penang and Malaysia. As we know, Malaysia has ratified the TPPA, a multilateral free trade agreement which involves new scopes covering government procurement, state-owned enterprises, intellectual property, labor and environment. Hence, in this forum, we'll be joined by a few experts in discussing the socio-economic impacts of TPPA on Penang and Malaysia as a whole. Also, we'll be sharing our key findings with a full report available at http://penanginstitute.org/tppa. I hope this forum will provide meaningful insights about TPPA to business communities, entrepreneurs, investors, and potential member countries of the trade deal. Without further ado, I now invite CEO of Penang Institute, Dr. Lim Kim Hua, to give his welcoming address.
Thank you, Jen. Very good evening to everyone. Dato J. Jayasiri, Deputy Secretary General of MINTI, YB Charles Santiago, Member of Parliament for Klang, Dato Wong Siu Hai, Chairman of Malaysian American Electronics Industry, and Mr. Fawaz Abdul Aziz from the Third World Network. Thank you very much for coming on a Friday evening, and I think this topic, as what Jen has introduced, is a very important topic. And let me share a few facts with everyone. Penang's economy is unique in a sense. It thrives on external factors. In the last 2 years, it has outperformed Malaysia's. It grew on 7.4% and 6.2% in 2014 and 2015. So outperforming the Malaysian economy by more than 1%. And why is that so? It's because the global economy has improved. So Penang's economy is unique in that sense. It's very much outward looking. And the uniqueness doesn't stop here, because the balance of trade of Penang, consistently, Penang contributes about 20 or 30% of the balance of trade surplus of Malaysia. So although we are the second smallest state, we actually contribute quite significantly. And if you look at in terms of trading amount that we do on a yearly basis, Malaysia has always been recognized as a very open economy. More than about 150, 130% of GDP of Malaysia is trading. And Singapore, likewise, about 350% as a percentage of GDP is trade. But for Penang, it is even higher. That's in 2014 is 464%. So as a measure of how open and how much we trade with overseas, we are very, very open. So this topic, TPPA, of course, transcends trade. And as such, it will transcend a lot of the things that will affect Penang, whether it's in business, whether it's in investment, services, trades of goods and services, and of course, the influence of foreign direct investment into the country, into Penang as well. From a Penang's perspective, consistently, Singapore, Japan, United States of America, consistently rank as one of the top 5, top 10 investors in Penang. So, at the same time, the global economy is changing drastically. The Chinese economy is rebalancing, changing from an export-driven economy towards a consumer type of economy. And at the same time, Silicon Valley is innovating very quickly. And there's lots of disruptive technologies coming out from there. And you see that in Uber, you see that in some aspects of banking, some aspects of financial services. So all this disruptive technology is affecting a lot of how business and trade is moving. And at the same time, there's there's competition of influence in the region. We know that the Chinese is extending its influence. Likewise, the United States of America is also trying to maintain its influence in this region. So all these are executed through various vehicles, whether it's AIIB, whether it's One Belt, One Road, whether it is TPP, etc. So this topic on TPP has been looked at by other people as well. The PricewaterhouseCoopers have done a report specifically on the impact on each specific sector in Malaysia. Likewise, Penang Institute, we have also done a report looking at the competitiveness of firms on the individual firm level. And because Penang Institute, we also have the mandate of looking at the specific impact on Penang, we are also looking at this closer look at the specific sectors like medical tourism, manufacturing, and investments. So, because this topic is a very sort of sensitive, cuts across a lot of people's life, what we have done today is we have assembled a distinguished panel as well as a balanced panel. So I'm very honored that Dato' J. Jayasuri, the Deputy Secretary General of MITI, has come to present his side, the MITI's perspective. Likewise, YB Charles Santiago, who has been very vocal on this issue, he has agreed to also come to present his side of the story. But we also would like to get the aspects as well as the views of the local industries. As such, Dr. Wong, who as the chairman of Malaysian American electronics industry, would then perhaps give us a flavor of how this might affect a significant portion of Penang's economy's situation. Likewise, we have also got Mr. Powers from the Third World Network, who is going to give us the perspective from the NGO perspective. So this forum is, of course, we hope to raise more awareness at one point, increase the debate at second point, as well as to enable people to have a more intelligent perspective of the whole issue. And I think we should try to give ourselves a lot more time and open up our minds and take a much more open perspective to this issue. And hopefully by the end of this evening, we will go away more enlightened or more confused, depending on which angle you are coming from. So with this, thank you very much again for coming on a Friday evening. We look forward to a fruitful and interesting debate forum. And without much, thank you very much again, and have a good evening. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Lim. Next, I'm happy to invite Dato' J. Jayasri, Secretary General of MITI.
Thank you, Dan. Dr. Lim Kim Hua, YB Charles Santiago, Dr. Wong Siu Hai, and J. Fawaz Aziz. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to thank Penang Institute for bringing us all together this evening. Not so much to embark on a debate, but I think to enrich ourselves on what the TPPA is all about. I've been given around half an hour, and I think I will not be able to do justice in half an hour what took us to negotiate over 5 years. But I have deliberately chosen some issues which are new to Malaysia's endeavor in trade agreements, and also issues which had actually generated a lot of interest. And I'll try to wrap up by giving a little bit of the implications for Penang. Now, let me start by giving a brief background of the TPPA so that people will be able to see this in context. We are a trading nation, small country, 30 million population. We've got 13 free trade agreements, and the TPPA is no different from the 13 free trade agreements that we have, because it is an agreement that confers preferential treatment to all its members. But the difference in the free trade agreement called the TPPA is that there are new issues that Malaysia is negotiating for the first time. And the scope of this agreement is far more comprehensive than all the other 13 free trade agreements that we have. And in this free trade agreement, we have got new rules that are being negotiated. And in the 13 free trade agreements, the treatment was basically on goods, services, and investment. And even that, in goods and services, there were a lot of exceptions and exclusions. But in the TPPA, we find that the scope is comprehensive with very little exceptions. And in the membership, you will notice that among the 12 countries negotiating, there are 4 countries that we are negotiating for the first time: the US, Canada, Mexico, and Peru. So in one single negotiations, we actually have preferential access to 4 new markets. And this agreement is open to all APEC economies. There are 12, and there is 9 more that is left. APEC economies comprise 21 economies, and the APEC economies will have access as members, but other countries can also seek membership, but they will have to be decided by the members. Now, the value proposition of the TPPA is that it has got 800 million people. It has a combined GDP of 28 trillion US dollars and accounts for 40% of global GDP. And this trade agreement is seen to be a stepping stone or a building block towards a wider initiative called the Free Trade Area of Asia Pacific. So the TPP is not going to stop at 12 countries. It is going to expand further to comprise 21 economies in APEC, and even more if there are interested parties. Now, this agreement was concluded on 5th of October 2015, and it was signed collectively by the 12 countries on 4th of February this year. Now, signing does not indicate that the agreement is now in force. In all international treaties, after you sign an agreement, you need to ratify the agreement before it comes into force. So ratification is open from the date of signing for a period of 24 months. And within that period of 24 months, all 12 original signatories must ratify before it comes into force. Now, if that condition is not met, then the next condition will be to have at least 6 countries accounting for 85% of the total GDP of the 12 countries before the agreement can come into force. So you will see that the US and Japan would play a key role in this agreement. Without their participation, the agreement will not come into force. Now, there are 30 chapters in this free trade agreement, and you will notice that some of these are standard legal chapters found in any international trade agreement, and most of the trade issues you find in this agreement are actually trade issues already covered in the World Trade Organization. It is just that some of them are new to Malaysia. For instance, environment is actually an issue already in the WTO. Government procurement is already in the WTO. It's just that we are not a signatory of the government procurement agreement. Labor is found in many of the other free trade agreements among the members. So the ones that are new to Malaysia are those like competition, dealing with state-owned enterprises, labor, environment, government procurement, and intellectual property is not new. We are already a member of the WTO. We are signatory to the TRIPS agreement there. The only difference is that in the TPP, there are higher standards negotiated in the IPR chapter. So these are the 30 chapters that you find in the TPPA. Now, what are the key commitments involved in this agreement? Market liberalization, goods and services. Like I said, it's a comprehensive agreement. There's very little exclusions found in the goods chapter. In most other free trade agreements, you will find that some of the sensitive products are excluded, whether it's agriculture, automobiles, or steel, alcoholic beverages. In all our free trade agreements, we have excluded alcoholic beverages, tobacco products. But in this agreement, it's a comprehensive agreement. We have included them in the liberalization. Our commitment is to eliminate all tariffs except for two items that we have excluded, and this is poultry and poultry eggs. Now, the commitment is for us to eliminate 85% of our tariffs on the first day that the agreement enters into force. So upon entry into force, we are required to eliminate 85% of our tariffs. The reality is 65% of our tariffs today are already zero. There are no tariff on about 65% of our tariffs. So what it means is that you can import from anywhere in the world, and for this 65%, there is no tariffs. Now the remaining tariffs, you will find that through our free trade agreements that we have among ASEAN, we have with China, India, Japan, Korea, Australia, New Zealand, and all these agreements have already been in place for at least 5 to 10 years. And in most of these agreements, tariffs have already been eliminated. So you are basically looking at very little tariffs that we will have to eliminate in the TPP. Even for tariffs that are implemented or in existence, you will find that if you are a manufacturer and you are bringing in some parts and components or materials that go into your final product, you can actually get exemption. The point I'm trying to highlight here is that there is very little revenue foregone for Malaysia as a result of the commitment to liberalize all the goods tariffs. Okay, so that's the commitment that we have on market liberalization for goods. On services, here again, we have comprehensive liberalization because the mode of liberalization is done on what we call a negative list approach. In the past, in all our free trade agreements and in the WTO, we liberalized based on a positive list. That means if I am prepared to liberalize, say, the professional services sector, I tell my partners I am liberalizing equity conditions for professional services. So that's a positive list. But here we take a negative list, which means that I will tell my partners I am not liberalizing equity conditions for professional services or wholesale and distribution. Okay, so that's the difference between the positive and the negative list approach. So in the TPP we use a negative list approach, and what is reserved through this list is we call a non-conforming measures list. So if we can't conform to the rules and regulations in the investment and services chapter, we put it in a reservation and we call it a non-conforming measures. So just to give you an example, we have taken off, say, Petronas, not Petronas, the Petroleum Development Act. The Petroleum Development Act regulates the petroleum industry. So we are not committing anything on the Petroleum Development Act, so we put it as a non-conforming measure. So we have policy space to do whatever we want under the Petroleum Development Act. So this is what we call a non-conforming measure. So this is how we make our commitments in the services sector. But by and large, the services sector will be now more open than before. Okay? But opening up the services sector doesn't mean that anyone can just come and provide services or establish an enterprise here. They will still have to go through what we call domestic regulations. In services sectors, most of them have got what we call domestic regulations, whether it is a qualification, whether it's a registration requirement, and these are requirements applied to both foreign players and domestic players. So you will have to ensure that you comply with them before you come into the market. So that's on market liberalization. Now on labor. Labor has been a very sensitive issue for not only Malaysia, but Brunei, Vietnam, and these are some of the challenges. These commitments that I'm highlighting you are also to be seen as some of our challenges for us. Now, labor chapter in the TPP does not talk about mobility of labor. So those of you who are employers here, hoping that the TPP will open up the labor market, you're going to be wrong, because the chapter does not talk about mobility of labor. The chapter talks about rights of labor, labor standards, okay? And these standards again are not standards that are proposed by the Americans or the Australians or the Japanese. These are standards derived from the ILO. We are a party to the ILO Declaration 1998. And in that declaration, there are 4 key principles that all members are required to follow or practice. And these include the freedom of association and collective bargaining, the elimination of forced or compulsory labor, abolition of child labor, and the elimination of discrimination in respect of employment and occupation. So most of these requirements are actually contained in Malaysia's labor laws, but they are not implemented the way the ILO standards have been designed, because there are certain discretion that is available to the authorities. And because of this discretion, the implementation has been questioned. Now, some of the key areas that would pose challenges for Malaysia are, number one, in the issue of the right to strike. Right to strike is already contained in our labor laws. We have, I think, 6 or 7 strikes in the past. But the threshold for implementing strikes has been very high. Now, the practice is in the ILO is that you must have a standard that is acceptable under the ILO, and right now the Ministry of Human Resource is discussing with the ILO what would be an acceptable threshold in order for strikes to be made available for unions. And this threshold would include things like voting for strikes to happen. Whether the threshold includes a simple majority, or it would include at least 2/3 of the membership of the unions before a decision can be made. Okay, so these are things that are being looked into. The labor laws have to be amended. Okay, some of these amendments in the labor laws and all the others, right now we have about 19 laws identified, and most of them are in the labor laws. Okay, so that's one area where we will have some challenge in deciding or getting a threshold agreed and accepted by the ILO. The other one is on the right of foreign workers to hold office in unions. Membership of unions by foreign workers is already there in our laws. Now, to hold office in labor unions, the ILO says that you should allow. So Malaysia will have to come out with a law which says that foreign workers can hold office, but subject to these conditions. So the Ministry of Human Resource have already come out with certain, I believe, some guidelines which will be part of the law, and I believe this could be a duration for the employment of foreign worker legally before he would be allowed to hold office. Okay? So this would prevent anyone coming in today and trying to hold office tomorrow. Okay? So to avoid all that, there will be certain conditions imposed. So these are the, in my assessment, this will be the two main concerns or challenges that we have in amending our labor laws. And some of these rights naturally will impinge on the industries, because if a strike happens, then it would be costly to industries. And sometimes even treating labor, foreign workers in unions can be disruptive. So these are some concerns that industries have expressed when discussing the labor chapter. I want to share with you is on government procurement, because this again is a new chapter for Malaysia in any of our past free trade agreements. We have never included or offered to open up through competitive bidding the government procurement market. But in the TPP, we have to make some concessions. So these are the commitments that we have made. And you will notice that the commitments are all on federal ministries. No states have been committed. no statutory bodies except for 4 statutory bodies under the Ministry of International Trade. No state governments or local municipalities will be subjected to the commitments on government procurement. So what it means is states, including Penang, local governments, statutory bodies, government companies, you can continue with the way you do your procurement. The federal ministries are the ones who will be subjected to the government procurement chapter, and we have made commitments, and there are thresholds that have to be met. To give you an example, for the construction sector, if the government were to bid or make procurement, if the threshold is 315 million ringgit and above, then you open it up for competitive bidding. If it is below that amount, you need not open it up for competitive bidding. That's for construction. That's for the first year. And you have 20 years, a transition period, where the threshold will be lowered to 70 million. Okay? Now for goods and services, it operates on the same principle that above a certain threshold, you open it up for competitive bidding. For goods, it is 7.5 million ringgit, and it will come down after 7 years to 650,000. Okay, so these are thresholds that we have offered. And Malaysia's thresholds are one of the most, or I wouldn't say the most attractive. It's higher than most of the other TPP members. And for construction, even Vietnam's thresholds are below us. Now, other TPP members have offered to open up their construction market for anything above 5 million SDR or 25 million ringgit. So a project worth 25 million ringgit and above will be opened up for competitive bidding in all the other TPP markets except Vietnam. So it means that Malaysia, although we have a 315 million, our threshold, we can still go into other markets because their threshold is only 25 million and above. Now, in government procurement, I think those who are here trying to sell to the US government procurement market would realize that you have not been successful because the US practices reciprocity. So if you do not open up your market either through the WTO government procurement market or through an FTA, then they will not allow you to get into their government procurement market. But by virtue of the TPPA now, we have a chance to go into the US government procurement market. And I think there are companies here who are waiting to get into the government procurement market. Those who are in the medical equipment industry. There are even American investors or companies, MNCs, who are located here producing for the US market, but they cannot get into the US government procurement market because of this reciprocity principle. So now investors will be able to get into, even US investors who have not been able to get into the market can do so now. Now environment is just like labor. The objective here is basically to maintain standards on environment, and the objective is to ensure that you maintain environmental standards and not compromise these environmental standards at the expense of pursuing trade and investment objectives or targets. And in the environment chapter, there has been coverage that includes some multilateral environmental agreements like the Montreal Protocol, marine pollution, and CITES. CITES is on flora and fauna, endangered species. There is how you control trade over these items. So these three items, or three multilateral environmental agreements, will now be under the TPP, and we are legally bound to ensure the compliance under these agreements. In the past, we have been signing multilateral environmental agreements, and even if we do not comply with the requirements, there is very little other parties can do. But under the TPP, because it is subjected to the dispute settlement mechanism, you are bound by the agreement to implement the requirements of these agreements. In addition to this agreement, obligation, there are obligations on ensuring that subsidies given to fishing will not lead to overfishing. Okay? And this is to ensure that there is conservation, and subsidies, of course, that the kind we give to ensure keeping the population or the fishing population above the poverty level will be excluded. Now, in addition to this, there is also the requirement for conservation measures, where we are required to ensure that if there is sufficient evidence that trade is taking place in violation of another country, another TPP country's environmental laws, then we would be required to ensure that there are sufficient measures to prevent such trade taking place. So these are part of the conservation requirements that we have under the environment agreement. Now, intellectual property protection. The IPR chapter is a very complex chapter. It covers many areas. Copyrights, geographical indications. It covers multilateral IPR agreements. It also covers patent, border enforcement. But the most difficult part of the negotiations focused on pharmaceutical patent protection. And in pharmaceutical patent protection, there were three areas that commitments were asked of. One is on patent extension, the other is on patent linkage, and the third is on data protection. On patent extension, basically, patent is not something created by the TPP, by the way. It is something that is already there. By virtue of being a member of the IPR agreement in the WTO, we are required to give patent protection for 20 years. But the additional requirement here is that if you approve, and the operative word here is through unnecessary delay, then you will have to extend the patent protection. Okay? For pharmaceuticals, besides patent protection, there is also this issue of data protection. Okay? Now, for pharmaceuticals in Malaysia, our approval rate has been 245 days for every application. And that has been the client charter of the Ministry of Health. So all applications will be cleared within 245 days. And the practice is about 2 years in other countries. So we do not believe that this 245 days is actually leading to unnecessary delay. Furthermore, the agreement says that unnecessary delay is determined in your own laws. And right now we do not have that in our own laws. So we will be amending our laws to incorporate the element of what would be the time frame for us to clear all applications. Now, patent linkage is basically a technical thing here where the patent office and the pharmaceutical regulatory body that approves pharmaceuticals will have to have a linkage. And the linkage here is before pharmaceutical marketing approval is given, they should ensure that there is no patent in force for that particular drug. Now, we do not want to be in a position where we have to undertake additional burden by monitoring whether there is patent or not. So we have come to a system where we call soft linkage, where we will basically have all the information necessary uploaded, and the patent holder will have the onus of taking an injunction if he thinks that a generic producer is coming into the market while his patent is still in force. And data protection has been one of the most controversial one, because for the normal chemical drugs, Malaysia has 5 years data protection. These are data protection for all those clinical trials. Now for biologics, we do not have any patent protection, or sorry, data protection. So in this negotiation, we had to concede and give 5 years data protection for biologics. Now, there has been a lot of discussion. I'm sure these are favorite topics of YB Charles on data protection for biologics, whether it's 8 years or 5 years. There was a clear option in the decision that was put forward, whether you can opt for 8 years of market protection or 5 years of data protection and other measures that provide similar level of protection. So these are two clear options, and we opted for the one that gave 5 years of data protection. Okay. Now, there are also things in the IPR chapter that Malaysia had negotiated which are not found in the concessions by other countries. Perhaps Malaysia and either Peru or Chile are the only ones who had this flexibility negotiated. And this is what we call access window. Now, access window here refers to a requirement by the Malaysian government that if you want data protection in Malaysia, then you have to file for your data protection 18 months after you first receive your marketing approval anywhere in the world. This is called access window, and there is a clear benefit by doing this. First, when you have this access window, you ensure that the innovative drugs, the new drugs, come into the market early. And when you come into the market early, then you actually pave the way for generic drugs to get into the market early. So there will not be an overhang from the 20 years and an additional 5 years because the drug manufacturer decides to come in to file for data protection at a very last stage. Now, in addition to this, we also have all our rights preserved under the WTO. We have a WTO Declaration on Health where you can actually use this facility when there is health measures that lead to compulsory licensing in order to deal with an outbreak of a disease. And this is a facility that was preserved under the TPP and not taken away. And this was one of the concerns that people had in the earlier stages of the negotiations, thinking that this will be taken away by the TPP. Okay? State-owned enterprises. Now this is a difficult area for Malaysia because you know that a lot of our enterprises today are state-owned or government-linked companies. Okay? And the rationale of having this in the TPP is they wanted to have a level playing field because state-owned enterprises are deemed to be enjoying certain advantages because they are state-owned and that they enjoy advantages, subsidies, grants, and so on. So the chapter does not say that you must get rid of all your state-owned enterprises. All it says is that if you are a state-owned enterprise and if you get into the business world, then you are required to observe some key obligations. One, you must behave like the private entity, where you must have commercial considerations in your decisions. And there should be no discrimination. And the other is that if you enjoy subsidies given by the government, then you must ensure that the utilization of these subsidies does not cause adverse effects to your competitors who are not state-owned enterprise. Okay? For instance, if you are a state-owned enterprise, you get government grants or soft loan or government guarantees for loans. Now you use this facility and then you compete and you undercut, price undercutting, and that cause adverse effects on another parties, entities. Then you will be subjected to a challenge. So these are some of the obligations that we have for the state-owned enterprises. But we have negotiated a lot of flexibilities to take care of our state-owned enterprises. You will see that there's state-owned enterprises which are independent public funds, EPF, KUAP, Angkatan Tentera, Tabung Haji, all these are excluded from the obligation. If you are a development bank like SME Bank or Bank Pembangunan, you are also excluded. Khazanah, because they are a sovereign wealth fund, they are excluded, but not the entities under Khazanah. They will be subjected. Okay? So those are those entities that are excluded completely from the obligations that I highlighted earlier. In addition to that, we also have flexibilities where if you are a state-owned enterprise and your annual turnover is 2.5 billion a year, you will be exempted from obligations for a period of 5 years. After the 5 years, the threshold will come down to 1 billion. So after 5 years, if your turnover is 1 billion and below, you will be exempted. So these are a lot of flexibilities that we have negotiated for our state-owned enterprise. Now, in addition to that, to help SMEs, Bumiputra enterprises, and also entities in Sabah and Sarawak for the regional development there, we have negotiated a carve-out of 40% of purchases by these state-owned enterprises annually. So which means that if I am, say, Petronas, I can now purchase on a preferential basis from these 4 categories of entities, but up to a limit of 40% of my annual purchases. So this is basically to allow state-owned enterprises to continue with the developmental role that they have been playing in terms of assisting SMEs and so on. Now, what are the benefits? Those are commitments and some of the challenges I've highlighted in those commitments. Now, what are the benefits that we have? Now, market access, of course, this being a free trade agreement, market access would be one of the main benefits. I'll go into the details. Investment flows. Of course, some will argue that there is no empirical evidence that free trade agreements bring in more investments. I may tend to agree with that, but I can give you anecdotal evidence where, as a result of free trade agreements, there have been new investments coming in, there have been investors expanding capacity because of free trade agreements. You want me to finish in 3 minutes? Okay. You should have told me that long ago. All right. New rules. The TPP has created a lot of new rules. E-commerce. Nowhere else do you find rules on e-commerce. So we've got new rules in TPP that is going to help us increase digital trade. Rules of origin. These are rules which ensure that goods that originate from TPP countries only benefit. So we've got rules of origin that will help now in ensuring that TPP members benefit from the global supply chain, because it ensures that there will be preference given to parts and components coming from TPP countries. Business facilitation, we have got a chapter on temporary entry. So if you are doing business with some of these TPP countries, if you are a professional service provider, there is a requirement for them to assist you in matters like visa and consular services, capacity building, customs procedures. These are all found as part and parcel of some of the chapters in the agreement. Integrating SMEs into the global value chain, I'll come to that. There's good governance through the TPP, transparency, anti-corruption, consumer choice. All free trade agreements actually allow for greater inflow of goods and services. So consumers have a better choice, not necessarily sometimes at a lower price. Access to medicine, I told you why I think that the IPR chapter lets us have access to medicine. Now, market access opportunities, I mentioned 4 countries we do not have a free trade agreement, and these are countries that will eliminate almost 90% of their tariffs on day one. The US and Canada will eliminate tariffs on day one, 95%. And Mexico and Peru will do 85% on day one. And these are big markets. Of course, Peru is not. Mexico is, and Canada are growing, but the US is definitely a big market. For services, we've got, if you're in any of this business, there are a lot of opportunities because all the TPP countries have agreed to open up and bind these sectors. And these are sectors which we have potential. Government procurement, I already explained to you. We have now access to the US market because of the TPP. Prior to this, we do not have access because we do not have a GP agreement with the US. Now, even though we have 2 agreements with Japan, ASEAN-Japan Free Trade Agreement, Malaysia-Japan Free Trade Agreement, we still find room to improve on those 2 agreements. There is still value added in this agreement because for the first time now Japan is offering to open up its plywood and agricultural market. Now, potential to develop the auto parts and components industry, because the rules of origin will dictate that you must source most of your parts and components within TPP countries. So if you're a car maker today in Japan and buying parts and components from China, Thailand, Indonesia, then you will have to now come and source your parts and components within TPP countries, and Malaysia provides that opportunity. SMEs, There's a lot of complaints that SMEs are going to close down, but actually there is a dedicated chapter in the TPP. The only free trade agreement that has got a dedicated chapter on SMEs to assist SMEs integrate into the global value chain. There will be a dedicated website and all the information needed for SMEs will be provided. Now, in addition to that, we must realize that when MNCs come and locate in Malaysia, they will not bring all the goods and services that they require. So there's a lot of opportunities for services, especially catering, security, transport, maintenance. So these are industries that will have an opportunity to benefit from investments coming into Malaysia. Now, before I quickly go into some of the benefits for Penang, let me just give you Penang's snapshot of Penang and the investment figures. You can see that the bulk of the investment from Penang comes basically from foreign direct investment. And these are some of the homegrown companies that are actually Penang companies that are actually exporting to TPP countries. I'm not sure some of you are owners of this here. Okay. Now, in addition to that, there are also indirect exports taking place because these producers are supplying to MNCs located in Penang. Okay. You can have a quick look at that. Now, these are the implications for Penang. Okay. First of all, as a state, you will be excluded from government procurement. You'll be excluded from state-owned enterprises. Land matters have been excluded. You know, land matter is the purview of states. And environment, only federal laws are taken into account. Now, there's going to be investment flow, there's going to be job creation, and there is opportunity for integration of SMEs into the global value chain. And I mentioned just now potential to get into GP markets. I know there are a lot of companies here that are actually producing goods that the US government procures. Now, what if we are not in the TPP? I think Penang will take the biggest blow, because not only new investments will not come in, but investors who are here may think twice of staying put. They may want to go into other countries who are already parties in the TPP and find access through them to bigger markets like the US. Okay, and don't forget, we are not just looking at Vietnam. In the long run, Indonesia, Thailand are also looking to be members of the TPP. I'm sorry, your 3 minutes is gone to 10 minutes. Now, my last slide is just to show you the way forward. So, this agreement, I will not conclude that it is all going to be just benefits. There are challenges, and the government is fully aware of those challenges. Now, before we ratify, we have to amend our legislations. I mentioned there are 19 legislations. The bulk of it is in the IPR and labor chapters. We are undertaking a lot of outreach. This is also part of my outreach to ensure that more people know about the TPP, not only the business community, but also other stakeholders. We are going to focus a lot on SMEs and Bumiputra entrepreneurs. We also have to equip the implementers. That's the most important thing, because it's the civil servants who will be eventually implementing this agreement. Because if they do not implement according to the obligations that we have committed, is great. And we have already decided there will be 2 committees. One will be a national implementation committee. The other is a more consultative committee, that will include the private sector, the NGOs, think tanks, and this will be a consultative committee where we can get feedback and strategize how to maximize our benefits under the TPP. So thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for hearing me out.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Jayasiri, for the presentation that sets a very foundation for the further discussion tonight. For information, Penang Institute has completed the study on the TPPA. We have uploaded on the website. It's more detailed than what you're having right now. So please have a look today. Let us present you the work that we've done. First, I will First, I will go straight to offer you a simple view of TPPA. I think Dato have give you a very good overview already. And next, I will share with you the key findings of our report on the competitiveness of Malaysian firms. Before I pass this session to Tim to talk about the TPPA impact on Penang. As for the TPPA, let me stress, this is not an ordinary trade agreement. It sets a precedence of having very extensive focus on the terms and conditions on the new issues, such as those on the green boxes. This agreement adopts a negative list approach, which is explained by Dato' Jayasiri just now. To understand what is the most concern by the federal government, we have to go to look at the non-conforming measures afforded to Malaysia. So across the Annex 1 to 4 of the Schedule of Malaysia, you can see that the most frequently mentioned obligations are the national treatment, local presence, and market access. So these are the areas that worry the federal government the most. And by chapter, you can see that most concerns that goes with the investment, cross-border trade in services and financial services chapters. And then by sectors, there are 30 sectors mentioned. You guys can go through the list for more information. So we thought of giving you more backgrounds, briefly mentioning about the works done before us. Due to a constraint of time, I will skip this. I will go straight to our studies. So, what leads us to the study on assessing the competitiveness of the Malaysian firms is that there's one important element in the study, the debate, is that we have to evaluate the performance of our local homegrown firms instead of the multinational firms in Malaysia. So we selected the public listed firms, a sample from TPP countries, those keen to join TPPA and other regional countries. So within Malaysia, we have 3 categories. We further make a distinction to 3 categories. First is the GLC or Bumi firms who enjoy the exclusions or non-conforming clauses. So second one would be the big non-GLC firms, and third we select the small SME proxy. So we evaluate those firms from 4 angles. First, by firm size, measured by the market capitalization and total assets. Second, by the market valuation metrics such as PE, PS, market to book value ratios. Third, by the firm level leverage, such as net debt per share, and the total debt to capital, total asset, and so on. And fourth, by the profitability as measured by the ROA. So the data period is from 1997 to 2015 across 10 industries and 41 sectors. During this period, some firms undergone the Asian financial crisis and the time when China joined WTO. So the key findings of our studies are, first, Malaysian firms are generally smaller by the market capitalization, and they have also smaller total assets. So there might be disadvantage in achieving the economies of scale. Due to the more accessible borrowings, large firms are generally more flexible and competitive. And small firms in Malaysia are generally smaller than their peers from the TPP or those keen to join TPP and other Asian countries. Many have lower leverage, lowly rated by the market, and less profitable in many industries. So they are actually the group that will feel more competition post-TPPA. So therefore we argue the carve-out process actually are more relevant for the small firms instead of those crowd jewels the government wants to protect. And we detected no sign of impact on Malaysian firms after from the China's accession to WTO. So we go to the bisector analysis. We found that in the oil and gas industries, the profitability of the small firms is actually lowest among their peers. So despite that Malaysia is already practicing the non-conforming conducts in the oil and gas industry activities. So for the financial services, especially the banks, they are expected to cope within the competition despite they are being smaller than their peers. They have, but they have good ROA, above average market rating, and this is comparable to banks like from Singapore and Australia. So but in the real market sector, real estate sector, the foreign penetration is actually limited or prohibited. Coming to industrial, you know Malaysia is an industrial nation. Exporter, strong exporter in the E&E sector especially, but the study finds that the most E&E firms show that they have below average profitability. Small firms actually receive low ratings and confidence in the stock markets. So when the markets opens up because of TPPA, these firms may be the one that feel the stiffer competition. So sometimes the development of the industrial manufacturing sector also ties with the technology innovation, but unfortunately the technological firms in Malaysia are not competitive. About 85% of them are loss-making. Sorry, that's the study. For customer service, Malaysian firms still competitive, although some will have concern about the debt, profit and scale issue. Telco firms, usually large and highly rated, they're expected to do well provided they don't screw up the public relation. Consumer goods firms, especially the food producers, are actually of decent size, lower leverage and good market rating and profitability. So they are expected to gain advantage from TPPA. On healthcare, there are two small Malaysian firms from the pharma and biotech sector, but they are quite profitable. This shows that actually Malaysia actually lacks participation in R&D. But on the private healthcare provision side, we have a very large firm. This implies that actually Malaysia can lead in the healthcare services industry. Of course, I think the rising medical cost is the issue, is a challenge, but this also happens to TPPA and non-TPPA countries. So on the utility companies, they are usually highly regulated and most of them are considered as a national strategic asset. So from the current performance, they should not be negatively affected. So after showing you the key findings, these are the policies that are recommended to the governments and the industries to prepare ourselves for the TPPA when it comes to into force. First is to address the brain drain issue, to train, to attract, to retain talents. Second is to increase the productive use of the capital, avoid wastage and, leaders will say, corruption. Third, governance has to be improved, transparent and accountable to inspire confidence of business, trades and investment. Fourth is to support the growth of niche businesses, help them to access to finance. Fifth is to ensure sustainable development. Environment and social issues are important too in this consideration. Our report actually lastly concluded that Malaysia joins TPPA is a strategic decision, yes, but Malaysia may have lost the chance to reform due to rather extensive the exclusion clauses. This will have long-term repercussion on the long-term development. Our report also highlights that the structural problems and the constraints that impede the innovation. So, trade agreements surely will have losers and winners. But point is, how do we deal with the losers? Will they be given a path to developing, alternative path to developing their business or trade? Next, my colleagues Tim will illustrate the TPPA impact on Penang. Tim, please.
So, thank you very much, Dato, and thank you very much, Jihan. Now we come on the impact analysis of our study towards Penang. Our general expectation is that international trade and investments will increase. Penang is an open economy, even more open than Malaysia. Generally, there will be some benefits for consumers, more cost competitive for exports to TPP countries that might or will create more job opportunities for the local workforce, as well as a new market with lower trade barriers. So the trade investments, the PwC studies expected additional investments of 136 to 239 billion US dollars, higher export and import growth, as well as the PwC study said that opportunity costs of 211 billion US dollars over the next 10 years if Malaysia doesn't join the TPPA. What we mean with benefits to consumers is that we have cheaper imports and that phones, gadgets from other TPP countries will become less expensive. More cost competitive for exports to TPP countries. Tariffs and non-tariff elimination makes Malaysian products cheaper. 12 TPP countries account for 40%, as Datuk already mentioned. And the large market should encourage SMEs to increase and expand the production. And this is what I come to this later. More job opportunities are created. We increase the TPP foreign investments, demand in local goods, as well. Therefore, we have job opportunities which will be created. New markets with lower trade barriers. 4 countries which we have, or in Malaysia we don't have a trade agreement, so Canada, Mexico, Peru and USA will become a trade partner of Malaysia. The rest you already heard today. But also we see some general concerns, because domestic trade or business displacement for foreign supplies. We increase the economic inequality and widen the wealth gap in the society. We see that trade diversion instead of trade creation. There is a negativist approach in the TPPA that favors unprotected local businesses. I think that is a very big concern from my perspective. Prohibition on performance requirements, restrictions on the federal and state governments to set certain local policies. More expensive patented products, especially medical drugs and treatments. Differential treatments to local companies, and the risk of federal government facing the ISDS tribunals. We see that the most vulnerable business group are non-Bumiputra and non-international trading SMEs, and they fear that their business will be displaced by foreign suppliers, and hence local companies will shut down, or are likely to shut down, or local jobs will be made redundant. Big local and foreign corporations thrive on international trade and have large capital investments, but small firms and most people might get fewer favorable deals. To increase the movement of imports and exports rather than creating values due to the elimination of tariffs and non-tariffs is another aspect we see. And unprotected local business are exposed to an intense further competition. There is a restriction to federal and state governments to set certain local policies. There is national treatment and minimum standard of treatment accorded to foreign investors' constraints to government. They are refrained from setting local policies favorable to local businesses. For example, buy local products campaigns are forbidden. The risk of federal governments facing ISDS laws, we heard that already as well. Our study consists of certain impact areas on Penang's specific characterization of the economy, and we focused on the manufacturing, on the services, and construction, local government, procurement, and agriculture sector. So I invite you all to have a look. You can see this report on our website, penanginstitute.org. we see that Penang will benefit from the TPPA as a receiver of FDIs, open economy, as I mentioned, especially in industrial sectors. More FDIs are expected. We see that the creation of jobs for the local forcework are coming along, as well as a further diversification of the state's economy. Challenges, of course, are MNCs pay better, and that will create a shortage of skilled workforce for the local companies. When it comes to export, we see that there is an increase in export. The possibility of securing more government procurement from TPPA countries, especially the US. Secure jobs in Penang and attract state for job seekers in the region. We have bigger opportunities for local companies to participate in the global market because the market opens up. And more foreign laborers might be employed to increase the productivity for exports. The challenges are that there is more foreign laborers, and there is an exposed to global economic changes. When it comes to import, we see that the fall in prices for international goods, especially for Malaysian consumers, and cheaper imported goods for industrial products, as well as construction and medical uses. Challenges, we see that there is a decline in the balance of trade, as well as a rise in the dependency on imported goods. Firm competitiveness, Jihan already discussed it quite intensively, but we see that there's challenges in the competition from TPP countries, as well as challenges for the ones who refuse to adopt, the ones or the companies who refuse to adopt to changes and more competition, they are likely to fall behind because the competition might increase, and if you are not willing to adapt, then you might fail to win or lose this opportunity. The labor market, I think Datuk already mentioned that as well. Services, we see that the challenges, for example, as competition for TPP countries, as well as also a shortage of skilled workers. Tourism, I don't need to mention the beauty of Penang, but tourism is a major industry for us. And the opportunities, of course, that we have more job opportunities for local workforce, but we might face overdevelopment and traditional businesses might be eliminated. But definitely we see that more visitors are likely to come to Penang, and that would bring more investments. Medical tourism, also a very big industry for Penang. You see that we think that that more investments are likely to happen, as well as opportunities in cheaper healthcare facilities or more job opportunities. But challenges are that drugs or patented drugs become more expensive, as well as the low presence of local IPs. What we see is, as the policy recommendation from our side, is that we still need to attract FDIs by offering support. We must improve our infrastructure to attract more MNCs to come. That is not only a state government policy, that's also a federal government policy recommendation. We must encourage the local companies, and we have to encourage each of us to face more competition, to adapt, to take this chance, to change business behaviors, which might be good for the last 30 years, but we need to adapt and change. And that's why we need to encourage the companies to focus on their core competencies, and we need to invest in education, in healthcare, and in training. And this is basically the most important things which we see to create the better for Penang and for Malaysia. Thank you very much, and I give the word back to the teacher.
Okay, thank you, Tim. Up next is the discussion moderated by Penang Institute. Let's put our hands together and welcome the distinguished panels to take their seats on the stage.
Or still staying with us. I think we'll start the panel discussion as soon as possible. Let me perhaps at this point rope in Mr. Fawaz as well as Mr. Dato' Wong to give their perspective of the story. We have heard Dato Jayasuri's perspective. So, Mr. Powell, would you like to start off to let us know what do you think in terms of specifically the NGO's perspective of TPPA?
Which aspect do you want me to look at? The whole story? It's a very long story.
Some of the story.
Some of the story.
Well, okay, perhaps, all right, just to express my appreciation, thank you to Penang Institute for inviting the Third World Network to join in this discussion. Because we're in Penang, I think perhaps what I could do is I could focus on the issue of SMEs. And this is SMEs, as well as, if we have time, talk a little bit about the labor chapter, which Dato has spoken about. And one of the main reasons to focus on SMEs is because Penang is quintessentially the SME capital of Malaysia for many reasons. Overall, I think the report that Penang Institute has done, which is divided into 3 components, I think it's pretty balanced and pretty fair, because it talks about the possible benefits. It also talks about the concerns that we have. And I think one of the main takeaways that we have from the report is really what I'm concerned about is the end of the story is the TPPA is pretty much about large companies and how they will win. And much of the chapters and the provisions in the TPPA, as we have seen, is to give the upper hand to large companies. Whereas small companies, as Penang Institute report itself says, small companies are going to be losing out, from the environment under the TPPA. We all know, you all know much more about the situation, the challenges, and the issues facing SMEs in general. So I'll just mention some of them as innovation. You have the issues of innovation technology, the issue of human capital, access to financing. You have issues of market access and competition, legal and regulatory environment, which is not exactly promoting the build-up and capacity of SMEs. And you have the issues of infrastructure. But you also have many issues and challenges that SMEs face because of trade and investment agreements like the TPPA. And so let me just refer to them very quickly as well. Free trade agreements and investment agreements such as the TPPA, there's the issue of reduction of tariffs and duties on imports leading to increased competition. You have the removal of export taxes, for example, which could lead to large-scale outflows of much-needed raw materials and resources. You have the elimination of reduction of standards and other non-tariff measures and requirements that have, over the years, served to protect domestic industries. You have rules of origin problems that raise issues of trade diversion rather than increased efficiency. You have intellectual property rights. We've heard about impact of IP and access to medicine, but it also affects SMEs, especially those who are in the agricultural sector, because patents, for example, pesticides and herbicides, the standards for those patents are going to be higher. It's going to be, substances that are important for agricultural SMEs are going to be more expensive or kept more expensive for longer. They won't have access to those things as easily as they did. So that is one form of the IP issue that affects SMEs other than the medicine part that we've heard. And so with all of these issues, are they captured, are they addressed, are they tackled adequately by the SME chapter? And this is one question that I'd like to raise. You have all of these issues and challenges that SMEs face, You have the Association of Malaysian SMEs saying that 30% of SMEs in Malaysia will collapse because of the environment under TPPA. You have almost more than 90+% of SMEs being micro and small, facing increased competition. So is the SME chapter adequate in facing all of these issues and challenges? We say no. I mean, to take it superficially, for example, out of 6,000 pages that makes up the TPPA, the SME chapter is 2.5 pages. 2.5 pages in order to protect and promote SMEs over the decades that the TPPA will put in place. 2.5 pages. 1.5 pages of those 2.5 pages, 1.5 pages is about how the TPPA countries is going to set up a website to talk about how they're going to help each other, how TPPA countries are going to, and then all of the TPPA countries, they have websites that are going to link to a central website. So 1.5 pages on a website, talking about a website for SMEs. Another half page is talking about the SMEs committee that will be set up by the TPPA countries. And this committee is basically, from what we can tell, this committee is basically a talk shop. It discusses the issues, it discusses what could happen, it discusses programs that can take place, but there's really no actionable plan. In order to do things, you have to have a framework, you have to have a legal framework, you have to have goals, KPI, you need to put in resources. There's nothing in the SME chapter or anywhere else in the chapter that talks about what resources are going to put in place in order to build up SMEs the way that TPPA supposedly promotes them to be. So my final point is just the amount of selling that is being done, the amount of marketing that is being done to SMEs to convince them that the TPPA is going to be beneficial for them is not commensurate with what is actually inside the TPPA.
All right, so the concern on the SMEs is a main factor. Dr. Wong, would you like to highlight the American electronics sector?
Okay, I'm chair for the Malaysian American electronics industry. So my focus basically is more on the electronics industry itself, rather than all the sectorial other sectors of the industry. Just for your information, for the E&E industry, it is 35.6% of total export, which is 35.6%, 278 billion ringgit. It's 44% of total manufacturing. Employment it gives in the country is about more than 700,000 headcount. And the E&E export to the TPPA countries constitute about 41%. So if you look at the contribution of E&E industry, half of that comes from Penang, or roughly half of that comes from Penang. So it's quite significant. It's the largest export and the I think GDP contribution to the country. With the signing of the TPPA or by joining the TPP, I think there are a few things that is positive for the country. First of all, access to the US government procurement, I think is already spoken. Many companies here, I wouldn't say many, a few companies who are doing end products especially would benefit because currently they don't, they are not able to sell to US government directly. So with that, they are able to. Secondly, lower tariffs. Even tariffs itself, many of their products are already experiencing zero tariffs. They only, I think maybe probably 20% or so that it does not enjoy. So that TPP will give them the last few percentages. The other thing that will strengthen the industry or the perception of the country is this trade secrets protection and the IP, intellectual property protection. With that, with stronger enforcement, with stronger implementation, then I think for the country to attract investment in the higher value, high-tech technology will be very good. Okay, and then you have the other things that talk about the freedom of cross-border data flows. Previously, data in certain countries are kept in the country, and they are not allowed to be moved to another country if you are having business there. However, with this TPP, now there's a freedom of cross-border data, and therefore Malaysia being viewed as one of the choice location for data hubs, data centers, and some of these data centers and small ones over the different parts of the world will be consolidated, and you have economy of scale. And that, I think, Malaysia will benefit. So if you look at another one, which is quite important, is the labor requirement by TPP. It is quite high standard because you are talking about the ILO requirement. Now I know that many companies in the country are very fearful of trade unions and collective bargaining and all that. And we have gone through that since 1970s till now. Now with TPP, the Freedom Association, is going to prevail. Anyone can just join any organization or unions and so on. However, there are other requirements in there in terms of indebtedness, in terms of labor treatment of labor, child abuse, and so on. All that standards will be increased, and that makes Malaysia a choice location because if you can implement all that standards, for the whole supply chain, not just the MNCs, then that perception of that a country that's treating people well will bring great benefit to the country. So, couple of things, as you see how Malaysia is trying to grow, there are two engines they are powering. One is engine of trade, which already Dr. Jaya has already shown how we have greater access to market and so on. And then the other one is the engine of investments. So you have these two engines who are moving, well, and is powerful. Then the whole economy of the country will grow. Now, as you grow, then the local Malaysian companies, the SMEs, will grow together with these two engines. Okay. Now, if you look back, I just want to address some of the SME issues. If you look back into how we have developed, in the beginning, in the 1969, we brought in the FDIs. So a lot of FDIs came in from all over the world, from US, Germany, Japan, and so on. And with that, I still remember during that time, everybody says that these are all fly by night. Come this year, you're going to move out next year, exploit the labor, and then move on. When I joined the company, that's what I hear. So I thought, I better get out, if that's the case. But it turned out to be that I stayed in the industry for nearly 30 years, and you can see how the whole industry has moved from being labor-intensive to semi-automation to automation and so on, and then come to design development. And today we have other businesses, including shared services and business process outsourcing. We have all kinds. We have companies who are able to even manage P&L, and we have developed talents that is managing many companies all over the world, including companies in China, in Europe, US, everywhere. And as a result of the FDIs being here, many local companies were developed. And these local companies who started as small as today becomes a public listed company, not just public listed companies that are supporting the MNCs, but now they have gone global as well. So I see that as long as we continue to attract investment, we continue to grow the economy, the SMEs will grow with the MNCs, or they will grow with the large local companies, and the multiplier effect, I think, will be very significant. So I don't see the worry about SME being wiped out, because Today, we have already 13 FTAs. Out of 13 FTAs, 90% of these line items already zero tariff. So if the SMEs are affected today, are not affected today, I don't see it happening when TPPA coming. However, there are many challenges that we need to make. And I think some of the issues that were brought up already been addressed by Jayasari about the formation of capacity building for SMEs. As far as I know, currently itself, we have like more than 15 programs by the government trying to help SMEs. For example, we have market development grant, we have Bumi Exporters Development Program, Women's Exporters Development Program, Exporters Training Program, Go X E-Trade, many. Okay. Now the question is, will the SME take on the challenge and equip themselves and improve themselves? If you look detail the SMEs, only about 18% are exporting. We have 82% who have potential to export. I mean, I see that the opportunities are a lot for SMEs, only if they're willing to take on the challenges. If you look greater details at the 4 countries of the TPP countries that we are not doing business yet, there's no head-on in terms of the products that we are producing versus what they are producing. So, in fact, I think they're going to be benefit there as well. That they will buy our products, of course we will buy their products, but hopefully we will learn from each other and compete. At the end of the day, we have to compete. You know, there's no way out. So, with the capacity building of SMEs, with the growth of investments and the growth of trade exports, I think everybody is going to do well as long as we take on the challenges ahead. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Dato'. So SMEs could potentially escape that. One fact I would like to share with everyone is that 90% of the SMEs are not in manufacturing. 90% is actually services. So, YB, would you like to address us?
Waited long enough. Dr. Lee, fellow speakers and friends, bringing greetings of peace and solidarity from Selangor, as well as the Democratic Action Party. I'm going to focus on 3 sets of issues. Keep it very short. I know it's 10:20 now. That sleeping clock is already starting to tick. But today is Friday, so we can do a bit more. So there are 3 issues I would like to raise. First is the issue of a new movement developing in the United States. Second is about what is this project about? What is this TPP project about? And then thirdly, about the US geopolitical security interests in the region, Southeast Asia and elsewhere. The first point I would like to make is there is a growing movement now in the United States. And this growing movement says that we support globalization, but we don't support free trade agreement. Yeah, and its expression is very interesting though. The expression comes through to 2 people, namely Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump. The people who are supporting Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders, when they were polled, basically said that we have lost jobs. And how did they lose jobs? From the what they consider from the NAFTA free trade agreement, the North American free trade agreement. Yes, they said NAFTA came into being and we lost jobs. Where did the jobs go? It went to Mexico. So Mexico benefited. If you ask Mexican workers, did they benefit? They'd say no. We are paying slavery jobs, slavery wages in Mexico. So a movement is developing, and a study done by CBS news. Is it CBS? Definitely by Wall Street Journal, as well as CNBC, as well as Wall Street Journal says only 27% of the people they polled actually believe that FTAs brought about any benefit to the country. Now this is quite telling. This is a country that has seen maybe 15 to 20 years of the North American Free Trade Agreement and how it has devastated households, families, jobs, farms, and so on and so forth in different parts of the United States. And his expression is very clear, the support for Bernie Sanders and the support for God forbid, becomes the president, Donald Trump. But anyway, this is how it is manifesting itself. So there is a movement, at least in the United States, that is holding this, and that is pushing the Republican Party to a certain side. The Republicans are supposed to be the free trade gung-ho people, and a large chunk of the people who are opposing the free trade agreement are the Republicans now. And that is making the establishment very nervous. In fact, Obama is very nervous because one of his last agenda before he leaves is the TPP, and it might not see daylight. In fact, the Menendez senator was very concerned about trafficking and labor and so on, has told Malaysia very clearly, we will not decide to have to vote on the TPP before countries like Vietnam and Malaysia sign on to and implement the labor provisions. So this is getting a bit sticky, getting very personal, and therefore the passage of TPP is in the United States itself is very murky. Although the understanding is 85% of the GDP, total GDP of all the countries agree to support the TPP will go through, but I think if America says it's not going to happen, it's going to fall apart. And the opposition is coming within the United States, within the Democratic Party, as well as the Republican Party. So interesting times. So that's one. Number two, whose project is this? Whose project is this? And in my view, it's a business project. It's clearly a business project. And I'll give you an example of this. Now, if you look at the patent issues that Dato have talked about, what he did not share with us, although of course he didn't have the time and so on and so forth, is that we are moving away from the TRIPS agreement to a TRIPS Plus agreement. This is very, very important to understand. The Americans, especially the US pharmaceutical companies, were dead against the TRIPS agreement already. What was the TRIPS agreement? The TRIPS agreement has many controversies. Right? We don't go to the controversy, it's 1025, no controversy right now. But the point was basically to balance affordability for medicine versus profitability of companies. To bring in some kind of balance between profitability and access to medicine as a right. Now, who pushed this idea? It's developing countries. Because developing countries were arguing basically that prices were going up and the big corporations were making money, tons of money. So they said, we need to balance this interest. We need to balance this interest, and that's why they said TRIPS agreement is important. I must, for those of you familiar with TRIPS, there are controversies though, but that's for another time. But this agreement that we have on the TPP is TRIPS Plus. It's TRIPS Plus. It goes further than the commitments made by our governments in TRIPS in the WTO. For example, patent extension is one of them. Number two, the issue of biologics, for example. Biologics is a joke, if you want though. Is it 5 or 8 years? And that tells you how the US had to come to a compromise between itself and the pharma companies in the United States itself. When I raise the 5 to 8 years, I don't mean just whether it's 5 to 8 years. It basically underscores the tension within the United States itself and other countries. Because the US government agreed with the other TPP countries, it's 5 years. But the US pharmaceutical companies say, not 5 years, they want 8 years. And preferably they want 12 years though. So why is biologics important? Biologics is a new frontier in medicine. It's a new frontier in medicine for cancer, for a whole variety of things. But Malaysia, which has no data protection, will now give them 5 or either 8 years of data protection, which means that it will be far more expensive than what you otherwise would have. So clearly there's a price increase. Number two, the Prime Minister of New Zealand, after having read the document, of course he was part of the process, says, yes, price will increase. He's quoted having said, the price of medicine will certainly increase. That's what he said. And he said the government will spend more money. The government will spend more money, and in New Zealand, the prices are regulated, as opposed to Malaysia, which is very much dependent on the free market. Although in the government sector, it's more control, but in the private sector, and if you go to the pharmacies, it is much more market-based. So we are moving away from a TRIPS Plus paradigm to a TRIPS Plus agreement where patent extension, price of medicine, and so on and so forth, data protection, all these will begin to change. Now you take an example of Jordan. Jordan is a good example of a country that actually embraced TRIPS Plus. After 7 years, there was an increase of 20% in prices. 20% in prices, and it also led to a decimation of the generic industry, which was a very thriving industry. In fact, today, if you go to Jordan and you compare the prices of Egypt, Egypt is far more cheaper than Jordan. So why? Because again, they moved, and why they moved to TRIPS Plus is because of the US insistence that they have to follow a TRIPS Plus kind of approach, which we also see in the TPP agreement. So we just moved to a different paradigm altogether, and this paradigm is going to put you and me into a deep shit though. And I say that very seriously because 1 in 4 Malaysians will have cancer. This is serious, my friends. 1 in 4 Malaysians will have cancer, and women, 1 in 18 women will have breast cancer in Malaysia. And to have your chemo for 18 rounds is 136,000 ringgit. People are now making choices whether they should have chemo or sell their houses. Yes, it has come to that. And the prices of medicine is going to increase. It's already increasing. In fact, if you compare Australia to Malaysia, the first 10 or the first 10 most used medicine in Malaysia and Australia, if you compare them, in Malaysia it costs us higher between 30 and 148%. And the study was done in Penang. So you add what is going to come as a result of the TRIPS Plus agreement, you are going to find prices very, very high. And that's not only prices of medicine, it also involves equipment, medical equipment, and so on and so forth. So this is a very serious matter. It's a fundamental right. Governments must ensure that medicine is provided as a right. But today, we are now unloading that. The government is unloading it and say, you take care of your own health care. In fact, the government of Malaysia, in the last 2016 budget, had cut the budget for healthcare. And again, another cut of 300 million as part of the austerity drive, which has not been announced yet. It's already an austerity drive, but they're not saying it's austerity. So another 300 million cut. Okay? So this is a serious issue, and this is only for medicine. There are lots of other issues that we can talk about, which is a similar movement away from TRIPS to TRIPS Plus type of approach. The third point I'd like to make is this is a geopolitical war between the US and China. Last year, in 2015, in the State of the Union address, Obama had raised the TPP 48 times. In this year's announcement, only 1 sentence. Because the traction is losing the traction in the United States itself. But the more important, the point that he consistently raises, if we don't set the rules, the Chinese are going to set the rules. Where he says basically there is a competition between for market access or whatever, and for military geopolitical interest between the Chinese and the Americans. And therefore, this is part of a larger empire building of the United States to lock in countries that are part of the TPP, which are 12 and can also increase in time to come. But China is not stupid. China took on its own trade agreement. It's called the Regional Cooperation for Economic Partnership. But China has got another approach too. It gives you the lifeblood, like 1MDB, for example. So a country like Malaysia is caught. Malaysia is known since Tun Razak for its neutrality in the region. Neutral foreign policy Malaysia has. That's what Tun Razak said. And the government had followed it. Now we don't know whether we should jump to the American needs or the Chinese need though. The Chinese are actually giving you the blood for your heart to pump. You know, that's why the 1MDB support is very important though. Okay? But at the same time, you're locked into the US system. So this is going to be a crisis for Malaysia. And this is important because ASEAN too is now breaking away from the United States hold. For example, Laos and Cambodia are openly defying the Americans. After many, many years, in the last couple of years, both these countries, including one other country, are now saying we will not give 100% endorsement to the US presence in this part of the world. We are pro-Chinese. So some of the defense agreement cannot be signed in ASEAN, partly because Cambodia and Laos are saying, no, we're not going to sign this. So there is a break, even in Southeast Asia, in other than ASEAN, on whether loyalties to China or to the United States. So my friends, this is just not about a trade agreement. It's far more deeper than that. If there's only a trade agreement, only 7 chapters, we are done, we won't have this meeting though. It's got implications for politics, for lives, for livelihoods, for medicine, for healthcare, and geopolitics as well. Now, just as a last thought, Chair, is that NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, started off as a trade agreement, trade and investment agreement. Today is a trade, investment, and a defense agreement as well. And Ashton Carter, last year, when doing a debate for the Trade Promotion Authority of the United States, where they wanted fast track, made a point which convinced some of the senators that the reason why the US has signed on to the agreement is because in future we will upgrade the Trans-Pacific Partnership from a trade investment to a security arrangement as well. So the agenda is quite different, and let's not just be lulled by the fact it's about SMIs, it's about prosperity and so on and so forth. You don't need trade agreements for prosperity. You don't need trade agreements. Before trade agreements came into being, there was prosperity. Distribution was an issue, and it still will be an issue. So I think we should not be caught by saying that, oh, if we have this rules-based agreement, there will be prosperity. No. This is.
Thank you very much. So, on this note, I think I should let Dato' Jayasuri to make a few more comments before we open the floor for questions.
I'm definitely not going to get into a debate with MD. It's a politician, I'm not. No.
That's what politicians say all the time.
On SMEs, I think it's important to know that although it has only 2.5 pages of facilitation, capacity building, and so on, the provisions that have been incorporated in many other chapters which I mentioned, all that put together actually gives a lot of room for our SMEs to develop. The fact that state-owned enterprises can still buy in a preferential manner from SMEs gives room for them to develop. And then under government procurement, there is still the policy space for governments to give preferential treatment to SMEs. So while it may be true, the legal chapters will have just a few pages, these are designed to have a platform for capacity building to be done collectively. Individually, each country will still have to do it. And I think the fact is, even if you have SMEs facing competition, will they be actually facing competition from MNCs? Will an MNC come and take over SME business, services business? Are they going to take over the small businesses, restaurant, catering, transport? I don't think that they are going to actually be competing with MNCs. If they are already competing in today's environment where the biggest challenge should actually come from their regional counterparts, China, India, ASEAN, and all these countries are actually now coming in. And even in the services industry, we have actually opened up. And if our SMEs are all surviving, then I think they have already felt the competition and faced the competition. Michael Kang from SME Association just blurted out 30% will close shop. We asked him what is his basis. He withdrew his statement. Okay, so a lot of people make statements to get draw attention and get the SMEs excited. Okay, now I don't think a factual point I need to correct now, because you said export taxes have been removed and this doesn't help SMEs. Now this is again an issue where we have negotiated and we maintained the export taxes to ensure that domestic supply of materials will flow into our domestic processing capacity for SMEs. Now, the movement in the US with regard to the China, US, our take is this. We are negotiating a trade agreement, and as a trading nation, we don't have to choose between China and the US. We have arrangements with China already. We're doing very well. We got an ASEAN-China agreement. We are upgrading that ASEAN-China agreement. We are negotiating again another arrangement which includes China, Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. By the way, it is not a Chinese initiative. It is actually an ASEAN initiative. And we also have the TPP. In addition to that, we have got another 10 to 12% of trade which is not covered by preferential trade, and that's the EU market. And we are also going to negotiate with the EU. So we don't choose between China and the US, or we will trade with every country, and that's where our objective is, to create as much opportunity for the businesses. And I think when businesses grow, I think that is where the livelihood of the population is going to be. Without growth through businesses, I don't think the economy can prosper. And as a trading nation, I think opening up markets is really important for a country like Malaysia.
Thank you, Dato'. So Dato' raised a very important point, which is that not all services are tradable, and some of the 90% of the services SMEs are operating in areas where it's possibly not easily tradable. So at this point, perhaps you should open up the floor for questions. Questions, please. Gentleman in the front, please.
Good evening. I would like to address this question to Dato' Jayasri with particular reference to the chapter on labour. Now, you were talking about the freedom to form unions. As far as Penang is concerned, the workers in the electronics industry have been asking for an industry-wide union for, I think, 40 years. Can we take it that once the TPPA is signed, they will be free to form a union? That's my first question. Second, very interestingly, you said that when it comes to employment, there will be no discrimination in terms of employment and occupation. Can we take it that the government is going to drop its affirmative policies with regard to employment? Thank you.
I'm not sure about the affirmative action policy that is inscribed in law. The only thing that is, I think, in the civil service, if I'm not mistaken, the only discrimination, not discrimination, the affirmative action is in the civil service. But as far as private sector employees, I don't think there may be affirmative action. Employers may have certain requirements or preferences, but I don't think it is part of the law. So there may probably not be a real need to change that. The issue about non-discrimination and all those refer to much more than what you refer to. It refers to discrimination against, say, gender. And then not allowing women to work after certain hours. So all these actually are interpreted as discrimination in the workplace. Discrimination in the workplace, okay? Not in discrimination in employment. So these are the things that are being referred to. Now, on your issue or question, I believe if we fully subscribe to that requirement, then you will have to have nationwide unions. I think even before the TPP, there was already a decision to allow for Sabah, Sarawak, and peninsula-wide unions, besides in-house unions. I think that decision was actually taken to allow for peninsula wide unions, not just in the electrical union, workers unions, I think even in all workers unions.
Yeah, okay, just a few points. Now, access, as Dr. Jasri said, access to medicine, you said will improve. That was corrected by YB Charles. In fact, it would be either denied or reduced. There's enough data to suggest that. I think just put up the data as far as Penang is concerned. Now, vaccines are deemed biologics. So, take the instance of dengue. There's vaccine being tested out on dengue. There's a huge problem in this part of the world. Now, with it being deemed as biologics, then there will be problems in terms of access to vaccines because of cost. You find there's a serious public health concern, and you can't use this vaccine because of cost. Then this issue of data exclusivity. Now, this data exclusivity, actually we unilaterally, Malaysia unilaterally allowed for this data exclusivity chapter to be included by 2011. So that issue doesn't come as far as TPPA is concerned. But the point is, the pressure from the multinationals as far as the board, pharmaceutical board is concerned, is what has caused them to unilaterally allow for data exclusivity. So the point that I'm raising is this whole TPPA will benefit the multinationals and the transnationals more than anybody else. That's the reason why these sort of trade agreements at the end will be no good for consumers. Now, there are a few other pointers that I'd like to say. The other one is on, say, simple example of what's happening, say, in the country. Now, recently, the Ministry of Health has asked certain drugs to be given prescription, like clopidogrel, that is Plavix. This is a blood thinner, very essential for those who have coronary heart syndrome. Now, in recent times, we've asked for it to be prescription to be given. So these are some of the measures that will be taken so that we can go in line with the TPP. And final word is just a pointer. The latest is on statins and cholesterol lowering drugs. Do you know how much of money was made by these multinationals? Trillions were made before they came out to tell us these drugs are useless. So these are sort of some of the things that will go on. And I think at the end of the day, TPPA is definitely not good for health.
ILO is a very good standard to protect workers, but in fact, when we see as people say TPP is like a very special agreement. So when we look at whether is it worker rights will be protected, we have to look at the overall of the TPP, as TPP have this ISDS, Investor State Dispute Settlement. So we can see one of the example is when Egypt government, they want to raise the minimum wages of the workers, but the foreign company Warrior actually sued the Egypt government at a foreign tribunal. So whether is it ILO really protect our workers' standard under this PPP is quite questionable. And then I agree with Fawaz. Actually, under IPR, there are some of the patents is been neglected, is not talked about. One of it, I want to further explain, is UPO. UPO is actually one of the Plant Protection Act, which actually criminalize farmers' rights to own seeds, especially our small-scale farmer. And then it actually prohibits farmers from sharing seed and saving their own seeds, because like Fawaz has been has told, because the TPP agenda is actually pushed by those big corporations, and currently our global seeds is owned by only 6 mega companies, and you know, yeah, and then farmers have to force to buy the seeds, so it's actually increase their cost in farming. And then when Dato' J also talk about government competency, what transparency will be transparency will be this increase, but because this TPP is you know being negotiated in dark, so it's also I think the last one is about food safety, and also because of the GMO, this imports of more GMO, and our consumers' food safety and should also be protected. So I think that's all from me. And maybe if our panelists would like to address, yeah.
Thank you. Perhaps another question, and then we'll come to the question, panelists to address the questions.
Good evening. I've addressed this question to the YB, Charles Santiago. You touched on the geopolitics of the TPPA. It's more that it appears later on it might be more than just a commercial economic agreement. Obviously, it's stated it's US-led initiative and will be led by the 2 economies of US and Japan in the coming years. Then it occurred to me that it appears unusual or odd. Why is it that the 2 traditional allies of the US in this region, namely South Korea and Philippines, are not signatories to this? And you also, could you enlighten us on the parallel trade organizations started by the PRC, People's Republic of China, namely the AIIB, I think the Asia Industrial and Investment Bank, and the One Belt, One Road trade agreements. Thank you.
Thank you. So perhaps we start with Mr. Fawaz, who wanted to respond to some comments.
Yeah, no, I'd just like to, I think, raise a simple point regarding government procurement. I mean, we're always told that the mama and papa businesses, the ordinary businesses in this country, you have a $30 trillion GDP market out there with 800 million people that we can do business with, and there's a government procurement market out there which is for Malaysian businesses to take the opportunity in. If we just take the fact that about 93 to 94% of the government procurement market in the US is monopolized by American companies. 93 to 94% of all government contracts in the US are won by American companies. And only about 6% are contracts that are given to non-American companies. And this 6% of the American contracts is given to about 140, 150 Companies from 140, 150 countries in the rest of the world. So about companies, hundreds of companies from 140 to 150 countries around the world are competing for less than 10% of the government procurement market in the United States. I sincerely wonder, is there any how many Malaysian businesses can successfully compete for that within that 6% of the U.S. government procurement market? I doubt that we have more than how many on our hands. I mean, I can count how many on one hand, how many Malaysian companies can realistically think about bidding for a contract in the U.S. That's one. The other thing that I wanted to talk about earlier but didn't have time is the labor chapter, because there's this perception that, one of the reasons why Michael Kang has said that 30% of SMEs are going to collapse, he said it's due to the labor and environmental standards which are high in the TPPA. And this is something that I wanted to address. Because our position is that the labor chapter really does nothing or next to nothing for workers in Malaysia. I'd just like to bring up a conversation that I had with a unionist who's been active for many decades, and he said, there's one country within the TPPA countries which is the main, which was the source of the pressure, the main pressure why the government started cracking on unions from the 1970s. And this is the same country that today in the TPPA is trying to convince us that it has workers' rights and interests in mind, and that's why it wants to include the labor chapter in the TPPA. This is the same country that pressured Malaysian government to crack down on unions in the 60s and 70s, and we expect the same country to have the interests and welfare of workers today in mind. The other thing that I wanted to say about the labor chapter is, with no exception, in all of the past U.S. free trade agreements, none of the agreements have led to amelioration. None of the agreements have led to an improvement in worker conditions and workers' rights in all of the countries that the U.S. has had free trade agreements with. In many of the countries that it has FTAs with, which included a labor chapter, the conditions and the rights of workers have actually gotten worse. You have union leaders who are being killed with impunity. Nobody is being charged, nobody is being investigated. You have unions being broken up, people being persecuted, being jailed. These are the same countries where the U.S. has FTA agreements, including a labor chapter in them. Now, the proponents of the TPPA, they say that the TPPA contains the highest labor standards. Now, we have to keep in mind that when the TPPA, the labor chapter, talks about violation of labor rights, in the TPPA, a violation is only a violation if a violation is committed in a manner affecting trade or investment between the parties. So if it doesn't affect investment or trade between the parties, it's not a violation. It's not an actionable violation. One footnote says, to establish a violation of an obligation under Article 19.3.1 or 19.3.2, a party must demonstrate that the other parties fail to adopt or maintain a statute, regulation, or practice in a manner affecting trade or investment between the parties. The other point that I wanted to raise is proponents of the TPPA, they say that the TPPA contains provisions to protect the rights and welfare of workers, such as for minimum wage, hours of work, and occupational safety and health, for example. But this provision goes on to say, for the greatest certainty, this obligation relates to the establishment by a party in its statutes, its regulations, and its practices thereunder of acceptable work conditions of work as determined by that party. I mean, there's a lot of things that we can say about the labor chapter, but my basic point is, it's all very nice wording, including the side letter that Malaysia has signed with the US. It's really good reading, and it makes you feel good about what can happen with regards to labor and unions, but none of it is enforceable. You cannot enforce, it's not enforceable under state dispute. There's very little actionable enforcement. Most of the burden of enforcement is on the country itself. Say for example, Malaysia. It has the standards that Malaysia has to rise to would be determined by the laws that Malaysia puts in place. So it's up to Malaysia to set any higher standards of work. Again, it goes back to the point. If it's up to Malaysia, then what has been stopping Malaysia from putting in place these rights and these standards already, unilaterally? Yeah, so basically my conclusion is that the main, I mean, what is put on a pedestal in the TPPA, what is regarded as valuable, is not environment, because again, environment, for many reasons, environment is also one of the weakest chapters in TPPA. What is valuable is not workers, because a violation of a worker's right is only a violation if it affects trade and investment between the countries. What is considered valuable is investment. What is considered valuable is capital and foreign investors. And I think if we compare, for example, the enforcement of the labor chapter to enforcement of the investment chapter, immediately if something is done that violates the right of one investor, that investor can immediately take the government to court. But this is not what workers can enjoy. Workers cannot take government to court if their rights are being violated.
Thank you, Chair. Friends. I would like to respond to Dr. Jaya's issue about affordability and access to medicine. I would like to share with you a quote from the Vice President of Eli Lilly. Eli Lilly, as you know, is a very famous, a very big pharmaceutical company. And I know it's late, but please just bear with me and listen to this. And the quote is this: the financial returns generated by the exclusive monopolies provided by patents are believed to enable pharma companies to recoup their cost of R&D, earn profits, and invest in future innovations. As such, the pharma industry is dependent on the protection of patents. That's the quote. Now, I would like to share with you the expenditure of pharma companies. Johnson & Johnson spent something like 8.2 billion on R&D. 8.2 billion on R&D. On sales and marketing, it was 17.5 billion. And they made a profit of 13.8 billion and a profit margin of 19%. Okay, that's the tip of the iceberg. It's going to get worse now. Pfizer spent 6.6 on R&D, billion, not Malaysian ringgit million, it's US billion. On sales and marketing is 11.4 billion, and on that particular year, they made 22 billion US dollars in profit and a profit margin of 43%. This is making money from people's misery. And these are the people who are pushing for TRIPS Plus. These are the people who want the monopoly, or the, as you say, the sanctity of patents to be extended so that they can make more money. Every year they extend the patent, they can make more money. That's exactly what they're doing. Okay, and also, if you look at the numbers, in 2013, one of the biggest lobbies for the TPPA is pharma. And in 2013, they spent 250 million US dollars to lobby the US government to put what they want in the agreement. In fact, in the United States, there's a revolving door which involved lobbies and the US trade representatives and the companies. And sometimes the guys who are lobbyists are also people who are writing the agreement itself. And they have what they call cleared advisors who have access to documents. And they're quite boastful about it also. And therefore, my friends, the very people who are going to benefit from this agreement are the people who are writing the agreement as well. So therefore, I leave it to you to judge whether this is an agreement for the poor, for the rich, the people, or for the elite class. You make the decision whether it's for the 1% or the 99%. Now, it's now our colleague at the back made a very interesting point that the negotiations were done in the dark. This is kind of scary though. It's kind of a secret operation going on. And it's indeed true. It is the secret negotiations. The only group, I should say, or only leak that is most transparent in the world is WikiLeaks. Whether it's Panama Leaks or whether it's WikiLeaks, they are giving us information which our government should give you. They are doing a better job than our governments. So in terms of consultation, we have no idea what's happening. Even business in Malaysia has no idea how the agreement is going to protect their interest. If business has no idea how it's going to protect their interest, what more labor, farmers, fishermen, and so on. Okay? Now, so therefore, these negotiations were done in secret for 5 years. And all that we could read was from the papers, from the leaks, or when two countries are fighting with each other, they will say something, so we pick up from that, and so on. And then finally there will be a WikiLeaks leak on the patent chapter, on intellectual property rights. And then there will be a leak on ISDS. And that's when everybody will jump and say, you guys are useless, your governments are useless, you must tell us what's happening. And true enough, the leak is today true. Because some of the things that in the leak were actually realized in the final document. And because of the pressure from civil society and other groups, some of it was removed as well. So therefore, WikiLeaks is the way to go. Because they're far more transparent than our own government. And they're supposed to represent the interests of people. I'm in tongue-in-cheek here. But my friends, the point basically is, these negotiations were done in secret. But it is not done in secret for the US business. On the day when in Atlanta, when they couldn't come to an agreement on biologics, Michael Froman met the pharma companies 14 times in one day. And finally, when they couldn't do the deal, at 2 o'clock in the AM, he met all of them to tell them exactly this is the conclusion. Of course, they were not happy. And today, they are the guys who are protesting against the trade agreement. One of the issues is biologics. And biologics is a big issue for them because it is big money for them. And they're also big contributors to the Republican Party as well as the Democratic Party, and that makes the situation much more complicated. So this is done in secret as far as the rest of the world is concerned, but not so much for the US business interests, or maybe in some extent the Japanese interests as well. But coming back about the dark one. Now, there's a big darkness here because now governments have handed over their responsibility to another organization called, through what you call the investor-state dispute settlement. If a particular foreign company does not like what your government is doing, or does not like a policy that your government is pursuing, then technically they can take your government to what you call a tribunal. A tribunal which can overturn the decision of your government. Now, plain packaging is a good example. I'm going to take one extra minute to explain this plain packaging. The plain packaging actually involves the wanting to reduce the level of advertisement in our cigarette boxes. So Australia, Uruguay, New Zealand, and so on and so forth have put forward the idea of plain packaging, where they say they want to reduce advertisements in the boxes in order to stop people or reduce the number of smokers in their countries vis-a-vis public health. So it's the public health policy of government. Governments have a right to do it in the interest of its people, in the interest of wanting to spend less money for healthcare. But when Uruguay announced it, when Australia announced it, Philip Morris used the bilateral investment agreement, in the case of Uruguay, which they had with Switzerland, to bring Uruguay to the international tribunal called ICSID. In the same way, Philip Morris brought Australia to ICSID via a Hong Kong bilateral trade agreement which Hong Kong had with Australia. Now, look at the process. Philip Morris took the Australian government to the domestic court, and the highest courts in Australia said that Australian government had the right to implement public policy in the interest of its people. But that didn't stop Philip Morris from taking the case to the International Tribunal. So what does it tell you though? It tells you that the decisions of government can be challenged outside the country. One. Number two, it also tells you the decision of your courts, the highest bodies, the highest courts in your country, decisions means nothing for big corporations. They can challenge you. The point is not whether you win or lose. The point is to create fear. The thing is, you do it, we'll challenge you. And true enough, when Malaysia recently in the last 2 months said that they want to, Malaysian health minister said, a ministry official said, we want to introduce plain packaging. Guess what the Philip Morris and their kuncu did? We dare you to do it. We dare you to do it. Now what does this tell you? It tells you governments have become prisoners to big corporations. Have become prisoners to big corporations. And why should a trade agreement allow that? Is that about trade? Should we allow that in a trade agreement? I ask a simple question. Should we allow that in a trade agreement? No. No. Why should a country's sovereignty, including its policy-making process, be tied, be handcuffed by a trade agreement? So, yeah. So therefore, this agreement, as I said, is just not about trade. If it's trade, 7 chapters, done deal. It's far more bigger than that. The issues are far more serious than that. But our government is aware, but behaves always as, it's okay, we will deal with it as the time comes. Right? And the advice they get also equally problematic. Okay, the question is that China is a big player, as you know, and China has got huge ambitions for the world. It has got, I think, 2 big initiatives it has got. One is the International Bank for Infrastructure, the ASEAN Bank for Infrastructure, no, AAIB, right?
Asia Infrastructure.
Yeah, it's an infrastructure bank. It's a huge one. And actually, Americans are totally against it. In fact, America advised Europeans not even to sign on to it. But he said, no, we're going to sign on to it. And that tells you a bit of a power play, on the power play. Now, whether it will take off, and they're going to pump money for infrastructure development. And if you know how China operates, especially in Africa, it will tell you how it's going to operate for the rest of the world. It tells Africa, very simple, we will bankroll your economy, but make sure that oil in your country comes to my country. We will bankroll. You don't worry about human rights. That only the Americans worry though. They only talk about it, but they don't do anything about it, the Americans know. Alright? But the Chinese say, you don't worry about human rights, you don't worry about environmental issues, we will bankroll you, we will put enough money for you, but whatever uranium you have, whatever potassium you have, whatever natural resources you have, including oil, you park it, you bring it to my country, we'll make that possible for you. And we will bankroll you. And right up from the engineer, right up to the cook, will come from China.
Yes.
Yeah, the whole process is done by the Chinese. That's how they do it in Africa. And that has led to a lot of resentment among the local people that said, hey, we too need jobs. Okay? Now the same thing is going to happen here, where they're going to bankroll it. But it's really a power play between China, US, and more the IMF and the World Bank. The World Bank is seen as somebody who can actually deliver on development. Seen, I say seen, perceived. Not that they will do it, but perceived as bringing development, as well as the International Monetary Fund. Now you have a parallel body that can rival the US hegemony of the world. This is about hegemony. This is about economic hegemony, and it's a rival that's going on. And that is why Obama keeps saying, we need to write the rules, not the Chinese. We means the US, and within the US, who it is? It is a business US that is to write the rules. Otherwise, China will write the rules. And I think this is the big hegemonic war that is going on between China and the US, and it's very real. And it's very real. In fact, most of the jobs in America was lost not because of Mexico, but because of China. That's the fact. But most Americans think it's Mexico.
It's interesting that the front runner of Republican is a billionaire businessman, and he has managed to get the Mexicans to be the fall guy instead of the Chinese. So how much is it actually due to the canny way of politicians manipulating people's minds? Dato', would you like to respond to some of the
I think
comments?
he's still wanting an answer on why Korea and Philippines is not in. Actually, Korea has made its intention known to join the agreement long ago, but because it was already midstream the negotiations, they are not. Philippines has already indicated its interest to join. So if at all there is going to be an accession, I think Korea will be one of the first candidates to come into the agreement. It's not that they are totally out. Now on GMO, I think the requirement here in GMO is basically on a voluntary basis, and there's nothing in the agreement that is requiring us to change our GMO laws on labeling and all. Okay. On UPOF, yes, it's true that UPOF has got some provisions on the utilization of seeds, but I think for farmers to be able to exchange seeds in a minimum amount quantity, it is going to be allowable. And that's one of the reasons why we have been able to agree to join UPOF.
Could you give a definition of what is a minimized quantity? How much
that will be written in our act. How much it's not to be sold, but you said if it's farmers exchanging seeds that they have, that's going to be allowed. Okay. ISDS, I know YB Charles has mentioned, but I think I need to point out that ISDS is not a creation of the TPP. ISDS has been there for a long time. In 7 of our free trade agreements, we've got ISDS provisions. We've got ASEAN Agreement on Investment, which has got ISDS provisions. We've got 70 over bilateral investment treaties. We have got ISDS provisions. 2 of our companies have actually used ISDS to sue foreign governments, and 2 companies have actually used ISDS to sue our government. So it's actually a facility that is available for investors, both foreign as well as our own. And I think now if you look at Malaysian companies going out, I think, and our investments are far more than FDIs coming in. So this is a facilitative tool which our investors will also require. Now on the provisions itself, yes, there have been a lot of criticism on the ISDS, but the agreement has tried to inject a lot of improvements and certain safeguards to the agreement. On tobacco, we have got a provision in ISDS where tobacco control measures are carved out of the ISDS provisions. Of course, countries will have to indicate. In addition to that, there are other provisions or safeguards that we have included in the ISDS, and one of the important provision is the interpretation of the agreement itself is not going to be left to the tribunal, but it's going to be left to the governments of the agreement.
Dato', you have any comments, last comments to add?
Yeah, a couple of comments. First of all, I'd like to address the issue of the labor standards. You know, for us, it's mentioned that you know, it is just for the trade. However, in the current state, in current situation, you know, most of the MNCs have adopted the EICC standards, which is Electronics Industry Citizenship Coalition, and that standard is applied throughout the world. And if you look at the Verite report that talks about the treatment of Malaysian workers in the electronics industry, it raises many issues with the way workers are treated. So one of them, for example, it says we should not be holding the passport of foreign workers staying in 8 to 10 workers staying in one room, and then you have the issue of indebtedness, that the workers have to pay their agent a few $1,000s, and therefore they come here, they have no choice but to work for you, whatever hours you ask them to work. So you are in total control. So the EICC standard says you've got to do away with all that, and so that the workers have so-called not under your control, not under obligation, and so that they will not be abused. So that is already ongoing. The next step, I guess, the companies need to do is to get it down the supply chain. That means their companies will not do that down the line. No child labor, no working excessive hours in the week, and so on. So if a country can do that and maintain that kind of standard, then you'll be looked upon as a choice place for investment. And I earlier said about these two engines, investments and trade. So I think that it's already ongoing, and I think we just need to take it and implement it throughout the whole country, if possible. The second part is the freedom of association. We say that 1970s, we don't want it. In fact, all the American companies don't want it, even though in the US they can have it, but in the US somehow the laws are slightly different from ours. You know, and for example, termination, they do it on the spot or in 2 weeks. Here we have to do what do you call it, a domestic inquiry, and step by step, and then it will take 18 months to 2 years before you can terminate a person. So there are variations, even though the words are the same, but the implementation is different. So freedom of association, I think, is already happening. I guess it just takes time to evolve, and the companies definitely would want the workers to deal direct with them, and they will work hard to do that, and tell the workers that they don't really need a third party to represent them. Last but not least, I want to say one point that we are talking about TPP here, 12 countries, greater trade access, better investment, I think, and the multiplier effect, I think, will take care of some of the issues that you talk about SMEs. Today the SMEs are enjoying many of the economic growth. When the big companies are growing, they enjoy it because a lot of work being sucked out, and the support services and so on are taken up. Just imagine if we don't sign up for the TPP and Vietnam signs, I can tell you that many of the electronics companies at least will consider Vietnam as a choice location. Some might move, some might not expand in Malaysia, they will expand in Vietnam, and so on. So I see that there is more negative of not signing the PPP versus the positive of not signing. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Dato'. I think I started off saying that perhaps tonight everyone will leave more enlightened or more confused. So, but whether it's enlightened or confused, I see two managers from the hotel standing at the back. I think it's really time for us to be saying good night rather than enlightened or confused. So on this happy note, let's join hands and thank the panelists. And of course, thank you very much for staying up late for us, and we hope to see you again in our next event. Thank you.